In every major conflict American soldiers have fought in, the mathematical odds of suffering a total psychological collapse were historically higher than the chances of being killed by enemy fire.
Yeah, it's a sobering statistic.
I mean, just let that sink in for a second. The human mind is fundamentally not built for the battlefield. After just 2 months of continuous combat, 98% of surviving personnel become psychiatric casualties.
Right.
Welcome to the deep dive, learner. If you are joining us today, whether you're a student of history, someone trying to make sense of, the dizzying daily headlines, or just insanely curious about the darker corners of human nature, you are in the right place.
Because today we are taking on a monumental topic.
Far more.
Yeah. It is the ultimate human paradox. We are looking past the daily news cycle to understand the fundamental mechanics, the history, and the psychology of human conflict. We want to know the actual anatomy of war.
Right. And our mission today is to equip you with the mental models to understand the why and how of conflict without feeling completely overwhelmed by the sheer scale of it all. Because, the scale we are looking at today is just massive.
Unbelievably massive.
We are drawing from an encyclopedic synthesis of human conflict today. It's a massive aggregation of history, anthropology, political science, and psychology pulled from, basically, the master article on war.
Yeah, we are talking about examining millions of years of human evolution, thousands of years of recorded history, and a staggering amount of data on human behavior. It is a heavy subject,
yeah,
but looking directly at the mechanics of it is really the only way to actually understand the world we live in.
Okay, let's unpack this. Before we can even begin to look at why we fight, we need to establish what it is we're actually talking about, right?
Exactly.
I want to start with the very word we use to describe it, because I think we naturally assume the word war has roots in concepts like strategy or honor, or at least some kind of, structured military formation.
That is the assumption, yeah. But to understand war, we actually must first look at its surprisingly chaotic linguistic roots.
Okay.
The English word war derives from the 11th century Old English words wire and where. And if you trace that back even further through the Old French, it ultimately derives from the Proto-Germanic root "wirz."
Wirz. Okay, and what does wirz actually translate to? Does it mean like conflict or battle?
Not at all. Wirz literally translates to mixture or confusion.
Wait, really? Confusion?
Yeah. In fact, its modern German relative is the verb verwirren, which means to confuse, to perplex, or to bring into confusion.
Oh, wow. That is incredibly dark, but also, painfully accurate.
It really is.
The root of the word isn't about perfectly lined up battalions or brilliant generals looking at a map. It's about the absolute perplexity and mixture of bodies, motives, and destruction. It is fundamentally a state of total confusion.
Right, which perfectly sets the stage for the massive anthropological debate about its origins, because that confusion extends to the very beginnings of human history. Well, the fundamental question anthropologists have been arguing over for decades is, did war always exist?
Yeah.
Are we naturally a warring species, or is war a relatively recent human invention?
Because there is this pervasive, almost romanticized idea out there, right? The myth of the peaceful ancient human.
Yeah, the noble savage concept.
Right. The idea that before we had cities and agriculture and property lines, early humans just sat around campfires, hunted together, and lived in total harmony.
And there are anthropologists who argue exactly that. They point to evidence suggesting that Middle and Upper Paleolithic societies were fundamentally egalitarian.
Meaning no rigid hierarchies.
Exactly. The argument is that before 400,000 years ago, human ancestors might have clashed sporadically, maybe similar to how groups of chimpanzees have territorial skirmishes, but they didn't wage war.
Okay.
The prevailing theory among this group is that these early humans heavily favored positive, peaceful social relations. They needed each other for joint hunting, for trading, for courtship.
So what changes that dynamic, according to that theory? Surplus, like having too much stuff.
Exactly. Anthropologists like Raymond C. Kelly argue that organized warfare only really begins when a society has a high surplus of products. Basically, raiding begins in the richest environments.
Oh, that makes sense.
If you are a nomadic tribe and you have barely enough food to survive, and your neighboring tribe has barely enough food to survive, there's absolutely no reason to organize a raid. You have nothing to steal.
Right. You'd burn more calories fighting than you'd get from the raid. But I'm looking at the material here, and there is a very loud counter-argument from a researcher named Lawrence H. Keeley.
Yes.
And his findings completely shatter that peaceful image, don't they?
They absolutely do. Keeley is an anthropologist who wrote a highly influential book called War Before Civilization. He looked deeply at the archaeological record and ethnographic data, and his conclusion is, well, it's brutal.
What did he find?
He argues that approximately 90 to 95% of all known societies throughout history engaged in at least occasional warfare, and many of them fought constantly.
Wait, 95%? Yeah.
So the idea of the completely peaceful ancient tribe is essentially a statistical anomaly.
According to Keeley, yes. He found that primitive combat was incredibly common. Now, it wasn't the massive battlefield formations we think of today.
Right.
It took the form of small raids, larger organized raids, and outright massacres. Another historian, William Rubenstein, even noted in the synthesis that pre-literate societies were renowned for what he called their studied cruelty.
Studied cruelty. Man, I think I have to push back on that romanticized, peaceful human idea too, based on just human nature and geography.
I mean,
Well, when you think about early human raiding, it's kind of like a neighborhood dispute that escalates because there are no fences. Keeley points out that these early raids lacked formal training. It wasn't an organized military.
right, it was ad hoc.
But because resources were so scarce, building massive defensive works like a huge stone wall or a fortress just wasn't a cost-effective or even possible way to protect a hunter-gatherer society.
The vulnerability was absolute. Exactly. You are living in a constant state of exposure. If your neighbor gets hungry or desperate or just decides they want your territory, they are coming over. And there's no wall to stop them and no police force to call.
That vulnerability is the defining characteristic of early human life. But then the data highlights a massive shift. The Bronze Age.
What changes in the Bronze Age that makes things so much worse?
Two things, really. Specialization and metallurgy.
Okay.
Suddenly, society is producing enough agricultural surplus that you don't need everyone to farm. That allows for the emergence of dedicated warriors, men whose sole purpose in the society is to train for and execute violence.
Wow.
Combine that with the invention of metal weapons, specifically metal swords. You go from a society where anyone might pick up a sharpened stick or a rock to defend themselves, to a society facing a specialized class of fighters wielding tools specifically engineered to kill humans efficiently.
Which means the society being attacked has to adapt, or they get wiped out. If the neighboring tribe has metal swords and dedicated warriors, you better figure out how to get them too.
What's fascinating here is how this arms race ties directly into Charles Tilly's groundbreaking sociological theory.
Oh, right.
Tilly was an incredibly influential historical sociologist, and he synthesized this whole progression into one famous sentence. He said, "War made the state, and the state made war."
Okay, I want to really dig into that because it sounds like a riddle. War made the state, and the state made war. Walk me through the actual mechanics of how a chaotic Bronze Age raid leads to the creation of a government.
Let's follow the feedback loop. Imagine you are a growing society under constant threat of organized violence for your neighbors. To survive, you have to organize.
Right.
You need to build a defensive wall, you need to arm your own soldiers with bronze swords, and you need to feed those soldiers so they can train instead of farm.
But walls and swords and full-time soldiers are incredibly expensive.
Precisely. So to pay for them, you have to extract resources from your own population. You have to invent taxes.
Oh.
But people don't just hand over their grain voluntarily. To collect those taxes reliably, you need an administration. You need record keepers. You need tax collectors. You need a system of internal law in order to enforce the collection.
Wow.
The sheer existential necessity of organizing a military for survival literally birthed the modern machinery of governance. The bureaucrats, the courts, the treasury, they all evolved as a support system for the military.
That is a staggering way to look at history. The state, the very concept of government only exists because it was the most efficient way to build a war machine.
Exactly.
It wasn't born out of a desire for civic planning or public parks. It was born out of the terror of being conquered.
And that leads to the second half of Tilly's quote.
Yeah.
And the state made war.
Right, because now you have this massive apparatus.
Exactly. Once you have built this highly efficient tax-collecting centralized state machinery, what does it do? It is capable of producing even better, more expensive, infinitely more lethal machines for warfare.
It's a perpetual motion machine of violence.
The state perpetuates war because it has the capacity for it, and the threat of war continuously justifies the existence of the state. It's the core engine of human civilization for the last 5,000 years.
It's an engine that has just been gaining speed and power century after century, But here's where we have to look at how that state-built machinery has evolved, especially in our modern era.
Yeah.
Because if war built the state has fundamentally transformed the way we actually wage war today.
The defining pivot point in modern military history is the year 1945, the end of World War II.
Right.
The historical records show that since 1945, the entire landscape of human conflict has shifted drastically. The frequency of great power wars, where massive industrialized states throw millions of uniformed men at each other across clearly defined front lines to conquer territory, has plummeted.
We also haven't seen formal declarations of war the way we used to in the 18th or 19th centuries.
Exactly. But the material is very careful to clarify that war itself hasn't gone away, it hasn't declined, it has simply changed shape.
Right, so while those traditional state-on-state territorial wars have dropped, civil wars have actually increased in absolute terms since 1945.
The traditional battlefield is largely a thing of the past. The definition of warfare today encompasses incredibly diverse, complex, and frankly terrifying methods.
Let's talk about some of those.
Let's look at asymmetric warfare. This is a defining feature of the post-1945 world. It's when you have belligerents with drastically different levels of military capability and power.
Right, so instead of two massive armies facing off, it's a global superpower with an air force and satellites fighting a decentralized insurgency that uses improvised explosives and hides in civilian populations.
Exactly. The superpower can't use its conventional strength effectively, and the insurgency uses the superpower's size and political constraints against it.
It completely flips the script.
It does. Then the analysis details other methods that expand the horror of war far beyond bullets: biological and chemical warfare.
And the historical context provided here is chilling. We tend to think of chemical warfare as a modern invention, but it's deeply ingrained in this machinery.
Oh, absolutely.
During World War I, the use of poison gas caused an estimated 1 million casualties. Over 100,000 of those were civilians who just happened to be downwind.
It's horrifying.
And biological warfare isn't just modern laboratories engineering super viruses.
No, the concept of weaponizing disease is ancient. The material specifically mentions a horrific historical event, the Siege of Kaffa in 1346.
What happened there?
The attacking Mongol army experienced an outbreak of the bubonic plague in their own camps. Instead of retreating, they used their siege trebuchets to catapult the infected corpses of their own dead soldiers over the city walls.
Oh my God, they literally weaponized the plague.
Yes.
They used an infected human body as a biological projectile to start an epidemic inside the enemy city. The sheer ruthlessness of that is hard to comprehend.
And that ruthlessness evolves over time. Today we have cyber warfare, which doesn't attack bodies or walls, but targets the very nervous system of a modern nation.
Right, hacking and digital infrastructure.
Cyber attacks are designed to cripple information systems, shut down the power grid, destabilize financial sectors, or blind communications. We also have information warfare, manipulating populations through propaganda and data.
And of course, the ever-present threat of total war.
Total war is the absolute extreme.
That's where a state completely disregards any laws of war, places no limits on what or who can be targeted, and demands the absolute total sacrifice of their own civilian population's economy and lives to sustain the fight.
Total war is the Tilly feedback loop running at maximum capacity, essentially consuming the state that built it. But this raises a crucial question about motivation.
What are these states actually trying to achieve with all of these evolving methods?
Exactly. The synthesis breaks down war aims into a few very specific categories.
Some of them are obvious. You have tangible aims. A country wants a piece of territory, like the German goal of Lebensraum or living space in World War II.
Right.
Or a country goes to war over economic concessions, control of oil fields, or access to a strategic port. If you win, you can physically point to the thing you gained.
But then you have intangible aims. And this is where the psychology of international relations gets really fascinating.
Intangible aims? Like what?
Intangible aims are things you can't touch, like credibility or reputation or national pride. A nation might go to war simply to accumulate prestige.
Prestige, just to look tough.
But the analysis notes a historical perspective that conquest restores prestige, annexation increases power. A state's intense desire to look strong on the global stage, to not look weak to its rivals, can be just as deadly in driving a motivation as a desire for physical land.
I can almost see the internal government meetings. These war aims can be explicit, publish policy decisions where a leader stands at a podium and says, we are going to war for X. But they can also be implicit, right? hidden away in internal memos, secret discussions, where the real reason for the conflict is discussed behind closed doors, while a completely different justification is sold to the public.
Furthermore, aims can be positive or negative. A positive aim means you are fighting to gain something new, more land, more power.
Okay, and negative.
A negative aim means your goal is simply to forestall or prevent an undesired outcome from happening. You fight to ensure your neighbor doesn't get a certain technology or doesn't align with a rival empire.
Now, I want you, the listener, to ponder a paradox here. We just spent the last few minutes detailing how warfare has evolved into these terrifying new realms.
Yeah.
We have cyber weapons, biological weapons, and asymmetric insurgencies. Weapons have become infinitely more lethal since 1945. We have precision-guided munitions that can hit a target from a continent away. We have nuclear weapons.
The capability for destruction is unmatched.
But the data points out a completely surprising statistical fact. Since 1945, the number of battle deaths and casualties has actually declined.
It seems to contradict everything we just established.
Now, how does that make any sense? If the weapons are objectively better at killing, why are fewer soldiers dying in combat?
It's a great question. And the research points to a fascinating and often overlooked answer: the dramatic advances in military medicine.
Wait, really? It's not that we are fighting less or that the weapons are less dangerous, it's just that the doctors are better.
To a massive extent, yes. We haven't necessarily gotten worse at trying to kill each other. We've just gotten vastly better at keeping wounded soldiers alive.
Wow.
If you look at the medical logistics developed since World War II, the speed of helicopter evacuations, the invention of specialized frontline trauma care, the widespread use of antibiotics, blood transfusions, and tourniquets.
It's a completely different level of care.
Exactly. A soldier who suffers a catastrophic injury today has a dramatically higher chance of surviving than a soldier with the exact same injury in 1944.
Which is an incredible triumph of medicine, absolutely. But it fundamentally shifts the burden of war, because surviving a horrific injury means you are returning home, but you are returning home forever changed, often requiring a lifetime of care.
Yes, the long-term impact is huge.
And as we mentioned earlier, the post-1945 era is largely characterized by civil wars and insurgencies.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it means the geography of the battlefield has permanently moved. It's no longer two armies meeting in a muddy, uninhabited field in Europe.
Right.
The combat happens in city streets, in local villages, and civilian backyards. When war is predominantly civil war and counterinsurgency, the line between combatant and civilian completely blurs.
Which brings us to the most sobering part of our deep dive, the true cost. We've talked about the state-building machinery. We've talked about how the methods have evolved and moved into civilian spaces.
Let's look at the numbers.
Right. The math, the minds, and the money.
Yeah.
What is the actual quantifiable toll this machinery takes on humanity?
The numbers presented in the material are almost impossible for the human brain to truly comprehend. And it's important to note that estimates for historical war deaths vary wildly among scholars.
Because keeping accurate records during a slaughter is rarely a priority.
Exactly. The overview highlights a few key researchers who have tried to calculate the total historical butcher's bill. Let's start with William Eckhart.
Okay, what were his numbers?
Eckhart estimated that from the year 3000 BCE until 1991, war caused 151 million deaths.
151 million.
But the consensus is that this is a drastically low estimate. Why? Because Eckhart only counted recorded battles, and he heavily excluded indirect deaths, like famine and disease for pre-modern wars.
We're right, and history is basically written in unrecorded massacres. We only know about the battles where someone survived to write it down, or where a state apparatus existed to keep a tally.
Precisely. So then you look at Isar Gott, a military historian. He takes a much broader evolutionary view. Gott estimates that historically, throughout all of human existence, war has killed about 5% of humanity.
5% of everyone who ever lived.
Yeah. If you run the math on the estimated total human population that has ever lived, that equals roughly 5 billion people.
5 billion.
And another historian, Ian Morris, suggests it could be even higher. Factoring in the incredibly high rates of violent death in prehistory and the relentless grinding warfare of ancient empires, Morris suggests the total historical death toll from war could be up to 9 billion people.
9 billion human beings. I mean, that is more than the entire current population of the planet Earth just wiped out by organized conflict. It's unfathomable.
It really is.
And when we look at the deadliest specific conflicts in recorded history, World War II is always at the top, with an estimated 70 to 85 million deaths. But the records show that the runners-up are just as horrific, and they happened long before industrialized weapons.
The Mongol conquests in the 13th century. Using horses, bows, and brilliant, ruthless strategy, the Mongol armies killed an estimated 60 million people across Asia and Eastern Europe.
60 million, without a single bullet.
And then you have the Taiping Rebellion.
I want to pause on the Taiping Rebellion because this often gets overlooked in Western history, but the scale of it is staggering.
It really is.
This was a civil war in China in the mid-19th century, from 1850 to 1864. They didn't have airplanes, they didn't have machine guns. It was largely fought with rudimentary firearms, swords, and spears over a massive geography, and yet the estimated death toll is around 40 million people.
Yeah.
How does a mid-19th century civil war achieve that level of devastation?
It achieves it through the indirect mechanics of war we mentioned earlier. When massive armies move across a landscape for 14 years, they consume everything.
Right, they have to eat.
They burn the crops, they slaughter the livestock, they displace millions of refugees. The vast majority of those 40 million deaths weren't from sword strikes. They were from the resulting mass starvation and the rampant disease that follows malnourished, displaced populations.
Which brings up a critical point about the toll on military personnel historically. For most of human history, the enemy soldier standing across the field wasn't the biggest threat to your life.
Not even close. Historically, disease was the ultimate apex predator of armies. When you pack tens of thousands of stressed, poorly nourished young men into unsanitary camps, disease spreads like wildfire.
The statistics the synthesis provides here absolutely shatter the Hollywood perception of military campaigns. Listen to this. During Napoleon's disastrous invasion of Russia and the subsequent retreat from Moscow in 1812, it wasn't Russian cannons or even the freezing Russian winter that did the most damage.
No, it wasn't.
Typhus killed more French soldiers than the Russian army did.
The microbiology defeated the military genius. Napoleon crossed the Niemen River to invade Russia with an army of around 450,000 men.
A massive force.
By the time they retreated back across that same river 6 months later, less than 40,000 had survived. And historians point to lice-borne typhus as the primary culprit.
Wow.
In fact, the analysis notes that from the year 1500 all the way up to the start of World War I in 1914, more military personnel globally were killed by typhus than by actual military action.
It wasn't until the 20th century that our ability to kill each other finally outpaced the bacteria in our camps. But here's where it gets really interesting. And by interesting, I mean deeply, profoundly tragic.
Yeah.
We've talked about the physical wounds, the disease, the massive death tolls. But the psychological toll of this machinery is something society's only recently beginning to truly quantify and admit.
The synthesis cites a landmark World War II study by Swank and Marchand. And their findings are devastating to the myth of the stoic, unbreakable soldier.
What did they find?
They found that after just 60 days of continuous combat, 98% of all surviving military personnel become psychiatric casualties.
98% after just 2 months. It is basically a statistical certainty that the human mind will break.
The 2% who don't break, according to similar studies, often exhibit traits of clinical psychopathy to begin with. The normal human brain simply cannot endure the constant threat of death, the noise, the lack of sleep, and the requirement to inflict violence on others without fracturing.
And how did they classify these fractures?
Swank and Marchand categorized these fractures into severe fatigue, confusional states, conversion hysteria, profound anxiety, and obsessional states.
What does that actually look like on the ground, like conversion hysteria?
It means the psychological trauma is so overwhelming that the brain literally converts it into a physical symptom to escape the environment.
Like a psychosomatic reaction.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A soldier might suddenly go completely blind, or their legs might become entirely paralyzed, despite having absolutely zero physical injury to their eyes or spine. The brain shuts the body down to remove it from the horror.
Think about the weight of that. The state builds this massive machinery of war, but the humans required to operate the machinery inevitably break under the pressure. I want to repeat the comparison mentioned by Richard Gabriel in his book No More Heroes, because it frames this so perfectly.
Yeah, it's a powerful point.
In every single war American soldiers have fought in, the mathematical odds of becoming a psychiatric casualty were historically greater than the chances of being killed by enemy fire.
It is a staggering realization. The psychological destruction is the primary output of the combat experience, and that is just the military personnel. The ripple effects, the demographic scars that these wars leave on the civilian populations are profound and multi-generational.
Let's look at those demographics. The American Civil War. Based on the 1860 census figures, 8% of all white American males aged 13 to 43 died in that conflict. That is an entire generation, an entire swath of the future workforce and family structure just hollowed out.
Or look at Europe after World War I. Of the 60 million European military personnel mobilized, 8 million were killed, 7 million were permanently disabled, and 15 million were seriously injured.
So half.
If you do the math, half of the entire mobilized force of a continent was either destroyed or physically broken in 4 years.
And the financial cost is just as apocalyptic.
Oh.
World War II cost the belligerent nations about $1 trillion, and that's adjusted to 1940 prices. By the end of that war, 70% of all European industrial infrastructure was completely wiped off the map. Factories, railways, power plants, 70% of it gone.
The property damage in the Soviet Union alone is hard to wrap your head around.
What were the numbers there?
The records tally it up. The Soviets lost 1,710 cities and towns. They lost 70,000 villages. Over 31,000 industrial establishments were destroyed, along with 40,000 hospitals.
But the deepest scar on the Soviet Union wasn't the buildings, it was the demographic fallout you hinted at earlier.
Yes. The Soviet Union lost an estimated 27 million people in World War II. Because a massive proportion of those killed were young men who hadn't yet married or had children, it fundamentally stunted the post-war population growth of the entire Soviet Union for generations.
Wow.
They literally rewrote their nation's biological future. The birth rates plummeted because the fathers simply didn't exist.
The analysis points out that this demographic damage happens even in much smaller conflicts. It notes that a medium-sized conflict, which they define as one with about 2,500 battle deaths, reduces the civilian life expectancy of that region by a full year.
It also increases infant mortality by 10% and causes a 3.3% spike in malnutrition.
War doesn't just kill the soldiers on the battlefield. It reaches decades into the future and starves the children who haven't even been born yet.
Exactly.
Knowing this absolute devastation, the wrecked economies, the psychological destruction, the staggering death tolls, the multi-generational demographic scars, it forces us to ask the single biggest question of all. Why do humans keep doing it?
Right.
If we know the machine will destroy us, why do we keep turning the key? We have to look at the core engine. We need to explore the psychological and systemic drivers of war.
This is where we enter the realm of motivation theories. And the truth is, if you ask 10 different social scientists why wars happen, you will get 10 different frameworks.
Naturally.
As the famous Prussian military theorist Karl von Clausewitz said, every age has its own kind of war, its own limiting conditions, and its own peculiar preconceptions. Let's start by looking into the deep, dark subconscious, the psychoanalytic theories.
All right, Freud's territory. The overview highlights the Dutch psychoanalyst Joost Meerloo. He viewed war not as a calculated political strategy, but as a mass discharge of accumulated internal rage.
Meerloo's theory is essentially a pressure cooker model. He suggests that society, with all its rules and repressions, builds up this intense collective pressure of inner fears, frustrations, and hatreds among the populace.
Okay, so everyone is walking around stressed and angry.
Exactly. If that pressure isn't safely vented, it eventually explodes. War, in this view, is the safety valve. It is the horrific mechanism through which society discharges its collective rage through mass-sanctioned destruction.
So the war isn't actually about the territory. The territory is just the excuse the subconscious uses to let the violence out. That's dark.
Very dark. But then the material introduces the Italian psychoanalyst Franco Fornari. And his theory is incredibly counterintuitive. He suggests that war and violence actually develop out of our love need.
Wait, I'm going to need you to walk me through that. How does love cause us to catapult plague corpses and drop incendiary bombs on cities?
It requires a leap of psychoanalytic logic.
Yeah.
Fornari argues that as an infant, our entire world revolves around the mother. She's the provider, the protector, the source of life.
Right.
As we grow into adults, we transfer that deep psychological attachment from the mother to the nation. The state becomes the sacred object, the early mother.
Okay, I follow that. The motherland.
Right. So war, according to Fornari, isn't born from a desire to kill. It is born from an astonishing, overwhelming willingness of human beings to die for their country.
Oh, wow.
It is the desire to protect the in-group, to sacrifice your own body to save the mother. It is a deeply altruistic desire for self-sacrifice that becomes perverted into the ultimate violence against anyone perceived as a threat to that sacred object.
We commit the worst horrors against the outgroup out of a twisted, desperate sense of love and loyalty to our own tribe.
That's his argument, yes.
That is a terrifying psychological projection. But then the research presents a third psychoanalyst, Maurice Walsh, who completely disagrees that the general population has this latent desire for violence, whether from rage or love.
Walsh argues that the general population is actually quite rational. They don't want war. They know war brings suffering. But wars happen because the systems of power elevate psychologically abnormal leaders.
People with a total disregard for human life.
Exactly. Sociopaths or narcissists like Hitler or Napoleon.
But how does one abnormal leader convince millions of rational people to march into a meat grinder?
Walsh argues they do it by manipulating crises. During times of economic collapse or social instability, the population becomes fearful and just wants a strong, decisive leader to restore order.
And once they're in power,
The abnormal leader takes power and then uses propaganda to drag the neutral population into violence. The overview even quotes Hermann Goering, the Nazi leader, during the Nuremberg trials. He cynically laid out the exact playbook.
what did he say?
He stated that it is always a simple matter to drag a populace along into war, whether it's a democracy, a fascist dictatorship, or a communist state.
Right, I remember that quote. Goering said, you just tell the people they are being attacked, and you denounce the pacifists for lacking patriotism and exposing the country to danger.
Yes, it's a dark manipulation of human fear, and clearly it's a playbook that still works today.
Absolutely. But let's shift gears away from the subconscious and look at the biological hardware, the evolutionary theories.
The evolutionary framework, championed by thinkers like Steven Pinker, argues that war behaviors exist because they paid off in natural selection. In the harsh ancestral environment of early humans, survival was paramount.
Sure.
Pinker suggests we develop deep-seated instincts for revenge, what is known as the lex talionis, the principle of an eye for an eye.
But why would revenge be an evolutionary advantage? Doesn't seeking revenge just put you in more danger?
It does in the short term, but in the long term, it builds something crucial: deterrence.
Deterrence. Okay.
In a world without police or courts, if a neighboring tribe steals your food or kills a member of your group and you do nothing, you are signaling weakness. You will be targeted again and eventually wiped out.
Right, you become easy prey.
But if you have an instinctual, almost irrational drive for disproportionate revenge, if your neighbors know you will strike back with extreme prejudice, it creates a credible reputation. That reputation is your armor. It deters future attacks.
So Pinker is arguing we evolved to be violently protective of our honor and reputation because it was literally the only way to ensure the survival of our genes. It's hardwired into our biology.
That's the theory. But the material also points out that this biological hardwiring theory has fierce critics.
Yes, anthropologists like Ashley Montague strongly deny that war is a universal biological instinct. Montague argues that war is a historical invention, a learned behavior driven by childhood socialization. He points to societies that completely lack this supposed instinct.
Like the Semai people, right? The material mentions them specifically.
The Semai of the Malay Peninsula are a fascinating case study. Anthropologists observing them found that the concept of aggression, let alone organized warfare, seems entirely absent from their culture. Montague's argument is simple. If war is a genetic absolute, hardwired into every human being's DNA, how do you explain perfectly peaceful societies like the Semai?
If it was in the DNA, the Semai would fight too, which leads to the observation by Bobby S. Lowe mentioned in the text. Societies where warfare is commonplace tend to actively encourage their children, especially boys, to be aggressive from a young age.
It has to be nurtured. It isn't just nature.
So if biological instincts like revenge or deeply repressed psychological urges don't fully explain the vast scale of human conflict, we have to look at what happens when those instincts collide with physical reality.
Specifically, scarcity.
Exactly. This is where the economic and demographic theorists step in.
And to be perfectly clear to you listening, as we dive into these next theories, we're going to outline them neutrally, exactly as the source material presents them. These are historical lenses through which economists and sociologists view conflict. First, let's look at the Marxist theory of war.
The Marxist theory is fundamentally economic. It states that all modern wars are caused by competition for resources and markets between great imperialist powers. Marxist economists, particularly Vladimir Lenin, theorized that imperialism was a natural, unavoidable result of capitalism.
Walk me through the mechanics of that theory. How does an economic system necessitate war?
The argument is that capitalist economies must constantly grow to survive. To grow, producers need new markets to sell their goods and new sources of cheap raw materials.
Okay, that makes sense.
Eventually, the domestic market becomes saturated. The workers at home can't consume enough to keep the profits growing. Therefore, the capitalist economy must expand outward into non-capitalist regions.
And when multiple empires do this at the same time?
When multiple capitalist empires are all trying to expand into the same limited global territory, they inevitably collide. Thus, war is simply an economic tool of expansion.
And it's interesting, the analysis notes that on the extreme opposite end of the political spectrum, fascist theories also viewed war through the lens of necessary expansion, though for entirely different reasons.
Right.
Fascist ideology asserted a natural right of a strong, supposedly superior nation to expand its borders and take whatever a weaker nation could not hold by force. Both ideologies, while completely opposed politically, viewed conflict as an inevitable tool of state expansion.
Which ties perfectly into the demographic theories, because expansion is usually driven by population pressure, specifically the Malthusian theory.
Named after Thomas Malthus, the English cleric and scholar.
Yes. Malthus wrote that human populations will always tend to expand mathematically until they hit the hard ceiling of limited resources, specifically agricultural output. Food. When there are more mouths than grain, the population must be checked. That check comes in the form of famine, disease, or war over the remaining resources.
The text provides an incredible historical example of this Malthusian pressure being used as an explicit justification for war. Pope Urban II, back in the year 1095.
Held the First Crusade.
Yes, he is giving the speech that essentially launches the First Crusade. And he doesn't just use religious rhetoric. He uses a Malthusian argument. He tells the Europeans that their land is too narrow for their large population, that it doesn't produce enough food, and that is why they are murdering each other in civil strife.
Wow.
His solution: go conquer the Holy Land, take their resources, and solve the population crisis.
A literal pressure valve. And we see these exact Malthusian pressures driving conflict today. The synthesis points to the ongoing, violent conflicts between nomadic herders and sedentary farmers in the Sahel region of Africa.
What's happening there?
These conflicts are deeply complex, but they are fundamentally exacerbated by severe land degradation, climate shifts, and rapid population growth. There is simply not enough arable land or water for too many people, and violence is the result.
There's another demographic theory in the research that I found absolutely fascinating because it feels so predictive: the youth bulge theory, proposed by the German sociologist Gunnar Heinzen.
Heinzen focuses on the demographic makeup of a society, specifically the age distribution. He theorizes that a youth bulge occurs when an unusually large percentage of the population, specifically 30 to 40% of the males in a nation, fall into the fighting age bracket.
Which is roughly between 15 and 29 years old.
Yes.
And what happens when a society hits that specific demographic tipping point?
Heinzen argues that when you have a massive cohort of energetic, aggressive young men, and the society lacks the economic opportunities, jobs, or social structures to absorb them, violence inevitably erupts.
It's like adding high-octane fuel to an engine that doesn't have a transmission yet. All that kinetic energy has nowhere productive to go, so it just blows the engine apart.
That is a perfect metaphor. If we connect this to the bigger picture, Heinzen attributes some of the most massive disruptive events in history to these specific demographic spikes.
Can you give some examples?
The French Revolution of 1789. It occurred during a massive youth bulge in France, the rise of Nazism in Germany in the 1930s. It followed an economic depression, yes, but it also coincided with the largest German youth cohort ever recorded.
Unbelievable.
Even the horrific 1994 Rwandan genocide has been analyzed by demographers as being preceded by a massive unabsorbable youth bulge.
And when you look at global demographics today, as the data notes, there are massive youth bulges currently swelling in parts of Africa, West Asia, and South Asia. It's an incredibly volatile demographic mix if those economies can't create jobs fast enough.
Exactly.
But let's move to a completely different framework. We've talked about subconscious rage, evolutionary programming, economic expansion, and uncontrollable demographics. All of those imply that war is somewhat inevitable, a force of nature. But the rationalist theory takes the opposite approach.
Right. The rationalist framework, primarily developed in political science, assumes that states and the leaders who run them are fundamentally rational actors. They weigh costs and benefits. They seek the best possible outcomes for their state, and crucially, they know that war is an incredibly costly, destructive, and unpredictable gamble.
So the core puzzle of the rationalist theory is this: if every leader is rational, and everyone knows war is hell and terrible for the economy, why don't they just negotiate a settlement? Why do rational states ever go to war?
James Fearon, a prominent political scientist, examined this exact puzzle. In a landmark paper, he proposed three rationalist explanations for why diplomatic bargaining fails and rational states choose war:
What are they?
issue indivisibility, information asymmetry, and commitment problems.
Let's break these down because they explain so much of modern geopolitics. Issue indivisibility is the simplest to grasp. It just means the thing you're fighting over fundamentally cannot be shared or compromised on.
Right. It might be a piece of territory that both sides consider intensely sacred for religious reasons, or a singular strategic choke point. You can't cut a sacred mountain in half. It's an all-or-nothing scenario, so bargaining is impossible.
But the second reason, information asymmetry. This one is the most fascinating to me because it relies on deception.
Information asymmetry occurs because states constantly keep secrets about their true military capabilities and their true willingness to fight.
Makes sense.
In any diplomatic negotiation, both sides have a massive incentive to misrepresent their strength, to bluff their way to a better deal. Country A might have a weak army, but they act tough to scare Country B into giving up land. Country B might have a secret new weapon, but they hide it so Country A doesn't build countermeasures.
So both sides are operating in the dark.
Exactly. And the historian Jeffrey Blaney argued that war is usually the outcome of exactly this kind of diplomatic crisis. Because both sides have conflicting secret estimates of their own bargaining power, they both rationally but incorrectly calculate that they can win a war.
It's exactly like a high-stakes poker game. Both leaders are sitting across the table looking at their cards.
Yeah.
Because of the asymmetry of information, they can't see the other guy's hand, and they assume the other guy is bluffing. They are both absolutely rationally convinced they are holding the winning hand. Neither player is willing to fold and give up the pot. The only way to actually find out who is right is to put all the chips on the table and show the cards. That moment of showing the cards is the war.
That is precisely how Fearon describes it. And the third reason, commitment problems, is equally tragic. It means that even if the two countries could see each other's cards, and they did find a perfectly fair compromise that avoids war, neither state can fundamentally trust the other to keep their long-term promises.
Because there is no global police force to enforce the contract.
Right. This is known as the security dilemma. If Country A agrees to disarm today for peace, how do they know Country B won't use that vulnerability to attack them 10 years from now?
They don't.
Because they can't commit to trusting each other in the future, it is sometimes perfectly rational to fight a war now while you still have a chance of winning, rather than risk being annihilated later.
The synthesis also touches on a few other political science theories that categorize the causes of war into three distinct levels of analysis. First, you have the system-level theories.
System-level theories look at the entire global board. The most famous is the balance of power theory, which suggests that the international system is most stable when power is distributed relatively equally.
Okay, so no one is too strong.
Yes. States will naturally form alliances to prevent any one single state from becoming a hegemon, a totally dominant superpower. If one state gets too strong, the others will rationally gang up on it to restore the balance.
And a major sub-theory of that is the power transition theory,
which argues the exact opposite. It argues that a single strong hegemon actually stabilizes the world because no one dares challenge them. The danger comes when that hegemon begins to decline economically and a new rising power begins to catch up.
Right.
War occurs during that transition period. Either the declining power preemptively attacks the rising one to lock in its dominance, or the rising power pushes too hard to take the crown.
The classic Thucydides trap. Then you move down a level to the societal level theories. And the one that stands out here is the diversionary theory, also known as the scapegoat hypothesis.
This is a deeply cynical but historically supported theory. It posits that politically vulnerable leaders intentionally start a foreign war simply to rally domestic popular support and distract their citizens from internal economic or political failures.
Wag the dog.
Exactly. You create a foreign enemy to unite a fractured home front. The review notes that surveys of U.S. presidential popularity during wartime actually show empirical support for this rally-round-the-flag effect.
And finally, the individual level theories, which zoom all the way in on the specific leaders making the final call. The philosopher Ian King notes in the text that no matter the systemic pressures, most instigators of conflict suffer from severe cognitive biases.
Yeah, they wildly overrate their chances of success, and most catastrophic military decisions are rooted in a kind of insular groupthink, where the leader's advisors are too terrified to tell them the truth.
So we have built this incredibly complex picture. We have a state machine built for war, fueled by deep evolutionary instincts, pressured by demographics and economics, and piloted by leaders who are caught in high-stakes poker games of bluffing and cognitive bias.
Feels completely unstoppable.
It really does. If war is driven by these deeply ingrained, powerful systemic forces, how does the international community even attempt to put a leash on the monster? How do we contain the uncontainable?
That brings us to our final area of exploration: the guardrails, the ethics, and the desperate attempts by humanity to stop or at least regulate the violence. The morality of war isn't a new conversation. It has been fiercely debated for thousands of years by theologians and philosophers.
And it largely centers around a framework called just war theory. Let's slow down and really look at just war theory, because these concepts form the absolute bedrock of modern international law. The theory is divided into two main Latin concepts. First, we have jus ad bellum, which translates to the right to go to war. What exactly gives a nation the legal and moral justification to start a fight in the first place?
According to the classical just war tradition, there are 6 strict criteria that must be met for a declaration of war to be considered just. First, it must be declared by a lawful, recognized authority, not just a rogue general or a private militia.
Okay, that makes sense.
Second, it must have a just and righteous cause, like self-defense against an unprovoked invasion. The gravity of the threat must be sufficient. Third, the belligerent must have rightful intentions.
Wait, how do you prove rightful intentions? That seems incredibly subjective.
It is the most difficult to prove. It means the state must genuinely seek to advance good and curtail evil, usually interpreted as fighting to restore a lasting peace, rather than fighting secretly for revenge or territorial expansion under the guise of self-defense.
Ah, okay. What's the fourth?
Fourth, there must be a reasonable chance of success.
Meaning a leader can't just throw thousands of lives away on a suicidal last stand if defeat is completely inevitable.
Exactly. Wasting human life in a hopeless cause is considered immoral. Fifth, war must be an absolute last resort. Every diplomatic avenue, every sanction, every negotiation must have been exhausted. And finally, the ends being sought must be proportional to the means being used to achieve them. You cannot launch a massive, catastrophic war to resolve a minor border dispute.
Okay, so if a state mathematically meets all 6 of those criteria, they have jus ad bellum. They have the moral high ground to start the war. But that doesn't mean they can fight it however they want, right? Once the shooting starts, you move to the second concept. Jus in bello is the right conduct in war.
Yes. Jus in bello is what governs the actual battlefield behavior, and it rests on 2 massive, unyielding pillars: proportionality and discrimination.
Proportionality in combat. Explain how that works in practice. How can dropping a bomb ever be considered proportional?
It is a horrific calculus. Proportionality in combat means a commander may only use the exact amount of force strictly necessary to achieve a legitimate military objective, and the anticipated civilian harm cannot outweigh the military advantage.
Can you give an example?
Sure. If an enemy sniper is hiding in a residential apartment building, it is wildly disproportionate and illegal to level the entire city block with an airstrike to eliminate that one soldier.
Wow, okay. And the second pillar, discrimination.
Discrimination is the absolute foundational requirement of the laws of war. It is the strict requirement to separate combatants, whom it is legally permissible to target and kill, from non-combatants, civilians, medics, and prisoners of war, whom it is absolutely forbidden to target.
The review notes that failure to follow these rules, if a state abandons proportionality and discrimination, results in a total loss of legitimacy on the global stage. These just war theories aren't just academic exercises. They were the literal foundation for the creation of the United Nations, the Geneva Conventions, and modern international humanitarian law.
But beyond the legal frameworks, there have been massive societal and cultural efforts to limit war entirely. Religious opposition has played a massive role in shifting public consciousness.
The text cites a pivotal moment, right? The Second Vatican Council in the 1960s.
Yes. They issued a document called GandM, which unequivocally condemned any act of war aimed indiscriminately at the destruction of entire cities or extensive areas, along with their populations, as a crime against God and humanity.
A direct moral reaction to the horrors of total war and nuclear weapons. And we've also seen massive, organized, worldwide anti-war movements spanning the 20th and 21st centuries. Citizens marching in the millions to stop their own governments, from the opposition to World War I, to the massive protests against Vietnam, to the global rallies preceding the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq.
The public consciousness is shifting, But when wars do break out, and they inevitably drag on, the international community desperately looks for pauses. And the records make a very critical, often misunderstood distinction between a ceasefire and an armistice.
Because we hear those terms used interchangeably in the news all the time, but they are legally very different things.
An armistice is a formal, legally binding end to a war. It is the agreement that stops the conflict permanently, often leading to a peace treaty. A ceasefire is merely a stoppage, a temporary suspension of aggressive actions.
So the war is still technically happening during a ceasefire?
Exactly. It might be mediated by a third party, it might only be for a few days to allow humanitarian aid in, or it might be indefinite, but the state of war technically still exists.
But I want to look at the dark side of a ceasefire, connecting it back to the rationalist theories we discussed. The immediate humanitarian goal is obviously to stop the violence. But what happens when a rational, calculating actor uses a ceasefire not as a stepping stone to peace, but simply as an opportunity to reload?
That is the exact commitment problem Fearon warned about. A ceasefire can be weaponized.
Right.
It can give a battered combatant the breathing room to rearm, to reposition their forces, to dig new trenches, or to prepare a surprise attack against an unsuspecting adversary who actually thought the fighting was over. Because leaders fear exactly this scenario, ceasefires are notoriously fragile and incredibly difficult to negotiate.
So what makes them survive? If neither side trusts each other, how do you make a pause stick?
The analysis says the durability of a ceasefire depends entirely on mechanisms that reduce that information asymmetry. You have to take away the secrecy.
Exactly. You need physical demilitarized zones, so the opposing forces are physically separated and can't launch a surprise attack. You need verified troop withdrawals.
And people to watch them.
Crucially, yes. You almost always need third-party monitoring, like armed UN peacekeepers or international observers, to literally stand between the armies and verify that nobody is secretly reloading. But even with all these guardrails, the just war theories, the international laws, the peacekeepers' permanent peace remains elusive. And this brings us to one final, deeply unsettling sociological theory mentioned in the material, proposed by Louis Koser.
Koser was a sociologist who studied the function of social conflict. He argued that conflict itself, even violent conflict, provides a necessary function for human society.
A necessary function.
Yeah. He suggested that the struggle of opposing forces, rather than just being pure, meaningless destruction, might actually be a process that creates a succession of new equilibriums.
That is a really tough pill to swallow. The idea that a brutal war, with all its millions of casualties and psychological destruction, is just human society's chaotic way of balancing a social structure that has gotten out of alignment.
It is brutal, and it's deterministic, but it raises an unavoidable, important question. Can humanity ever actually evolve beyond this? Can we ever outgrow the need for this violently destructive balancing act? Or is this cycle of wordses, of confusion and new equilibrium a permanent feature of our species?
That is the ultimate question. We have gone on an intense intellectual journey today. We started with the chaotic linguistic confusion of early war, the wordse.
Yeah.
We unpacked Charles Tilly's terrifying feedback loop, where war built the state just so the state could wage more war. We looked at the shifting landscape of modern conflict, moving from battlefields to backyards.
The lot to take in?
We confronted the mind-numbing human costs, the 9 billion lost, the microscopic terror of typhus, the 98% psychiatric casualty rate. We explored the deep psychological, evolutionary, and systemic motivations that push leaders to the brink, and our desperate, ongoing ethical attempts to build guardrails around the slaughter. Staring directly into the mechanics of human conflict is heavy. It's dark.
But understanding these mental models empowers you to view the world and those dizzying daily headlines with immense clarity. You aren't just seeing the chaos anymore. You are seeing the actual anatomy behind it.
And as we close, there is one final provocative thought I want to leave you with, building on everything we've learned today.
We discussed Charles Tilly's famous assertion, war made the state and the state made war. The state as we know it, with its taxation, its borders, its massive bureaucracies, was entirely built to sustain massive industrial military campaigns.
But we also discussed how the nature of warfare is fundamentally shifting. Great power, state-on-state land wars are rapidly declining. The battlefield is moving away from massive armies and into the invisible, borderless realms of cyber warfare, information warfare, artificial intelligence, and decentralized non-state insurgencies.
If the very nature of war is fundamentally changing and moving away from the state, will the very nature of the state as we know it begin to dissolve?
If the machine changes, the entire factory that built it has to change. It's a profound thought to mull over. We will leave you with that question to explore on your own. But remember, the next time you look at the map of human history or the front page of the news, you aren't just looking at a clean, broken X-ray. You are looking at the confusion, the wordsa, and the endless human attempt to build order out of it. Thanks for taking the deep dive with us today. Until next time.